It was a quiet morning in Vermont, the kind that carried the weight of time in its silence. The sky outside was the pale gray of late autumn, clouds hanging low like they couldn't bear to rain. Evelyn Moore stirred her tea slowly, watching the steam rise from the cup like a ghost she didn't quite believe in anymore. The kitchen clock ticked rhythmically behind her, the only sound besides the occasional creak of her old farmhouse settling into the day. She had placed a small cake on the counter. It was chocolate, her favorite, and she had ordered it the day before from the local bakery with the specific note, "Happy birthday, Evelyn." The script on the cake looked mechanical. Even the icing seemed indifferent. She hadn't blown out candles in years. There were none on this cake either. Just her, a fork, and a slice of sugar meant to comfort something far deeper than hunger. At 72, Evelyn no longer waited for celebration. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. It was the 10th year, 10 years exactly, since anyone in her family had remembered her birthday. Not a call. Not a card. No text message, no email. Not even a "how are you today" masked as a casual check-in. She'd once believed it was forgetfulness. Busy lives, distractions, families of their own. But that excuse had worn thin. Worn thin like the soles of her slippers now brushing against the cold kitchen floor. She stared at the cake for a long time. It looked back at her with the kind of emptiness only food can offer. She took a bite. It was good, moist, rich, familiar. She chewed slowly. And when she swallowed, she felt a knot inside her untangled just enough to let tears rise to the surface. She didn't sob. She never sobbed. But a single tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't just grief, it was recognition. Recognition that she had become invisible to the people she had once loved fiercely. To the niece she raised while her sister battled addiction. To the nephew she paid tuition for twice after he failed his first semester. To her younger brother whose mortgage she covered more than once. All of them pieces of her life. Now ghosts who haunted the holiday seasons and birthdays with silence. Evelyn stood up slowly. Her knees ached, weather and time conspiring against her. She walked into the hallway, where family portraits lined the wall like a museum of loyalty misplaced. The smiles in the pictures were permanent, fixed, and terribly dishonest in retrospect. She stopped at a photo of her and her niece Kayla. Kayla had just turned 10 then. It had been a beach trip. She remembered the sunburn, the sand everywhere, the smell of sunscreen and orange soda. Evelyn had paid for everything. Kayla had called her Aunt Evie and held her hand the whole trip. Now she lived 2 states away and hadn't spoken to Evelyn in nearly 3 years. The last time she had, it was to ask for money to fix her car. No birthday wishes. Just bank account details. Evelyn moved toward the attic stairs. She hadn't been up there in a while. The steps groaned under her weight. She opened the door with a creak and flicked on the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust coated the old wooden floor. In the corner were several cardboard boxes marked letters and keepsakes. She opened one labeled birthdays. Inside were cards, dozens of them from years gone by. Some were store-bought, some handmade. All of them had her handwritings. She had saved the ones she sent. She didn't keep the ones they sent because they never had. Or at least not in the last 10 years. There were photos of parties she had thrown. Decorations, balloons, themed napkins for kids' birthdays. Her refrigerator had once been a canvas of family artwork and thank you notes. Now it was blank. Just like her phone log. Just like her heart when it came to the people who had once meant everything. Evelyn sat down on the floor. She was tired, soul tired. And in that moment, she decided something. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just quietly final. She would no longer wait. No longer wish for them to see her. Because she saw herself. She remembered. And she deserved more than silence. She deserved truth. And the truth was, birthdays shouldn't feel like funerals. Not when you're still breathing. Not when you're still alive. Not when your heart still beats with longing. She stood up again, slower this time. But with more resolve. Downstairs, the cake still waited. She cut another slice and poured herself a second cup of tea. She sat by the window, watching leaves fall like confessions from the trees. And she whispered to herself, "Happy birthday, Evelyn." It was quiet. but it was the loudest thing she'd heard in years. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to begin something new. The next morning arrived with a sharp chill, the kind that made Evelyn wrap her cardigan tighter before even stepping out of bed. The heater rumbled on like a tired old man, doing its best against the cold seeping through the windows. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. It reminded her of her mother's old front porch in Georgia, where mornings used to feel warmer even when they were cold. But nostalgia could only warm so much. And today, she had something to do. Evelyn dressed with deliberate care, a pressed cream blouse, a slate gray skirt, soft leather shoes that had molded to the shape of her feet over the years. She brushed her silver hair back into a low knot and added a small pearl pin her grandmother had once given her. It had been years since she'd worn it. Today felt right. She glanced once more at the mirror. Not for vanity, but for resolve. She looked herself in the eye and gave a small nod. Then she picked up the envelope she had prepared the night before and walked downstairs. On the dining table sat her will. Revised, printed, and unsigned. A clean break from the past. A redistribution of legacy. She had read it 5 times. Each line cut a little deeper, but also cleaner. Her lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, had been a student of hers once. Now he ran a boutique firm in town. Kind, discreet, no nonsense. He was the one person she trusted with this final redirection. The drive into town was slow. The roads were damp with last night's drizzle, and golden leaves clung stubbornly to the windshield. Evelyn didn't turn on the radio. Silence was her companion today. When she reached the law office, Jonathan greeted her at the door with a gentle smile. He always did. "You're early," he said, guiding her inside. "I figured today might weigh a little heavy." She smiled faintly. "It does, but it also feels necessary." They sat across from one another at a polished oak desk. He offered her a cup of chamomile tea and she accepted. He read over the revised documents. Every clause was clear. Every beneficiary named with intention. No room for confusion, no room for guilt. 50% of her assets to establish scholarships for female students in literature and linguistics. 20% to the local library for expansion and renovation. 10% to the nursing staff at the regional hospice care center where her mother had passed. 10% to animal rescue shelters she had long supported anonymously. And the last 10, her discretionary donation to the Vermont Writers' Fund. A nod to voices like hers that had been silenced too long. No family members were named. Not one. Jonathan looked at her after the final page. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. She had told him enough over the years. Instead, he slid a fountain pen across the desk. And she signed. A signature more steady than her own heart. But final. When it was done, she handed him the envelope she had brought. "These are the letters, please send them after I'm gone." Jonathan hesitated only briefly. Then nodded. "I'll respect your wishes, Evelyn." No early surprises, no confrontation. She thanked him. Not just for his help, but for seeing her. On the way home, rain began to fall. Just a gentle drizzle, tapping on the windshield like fingers asking to be let in. She didn't mind. She welcomed it. It reminded her of the poetry she used to teach. How endings often arrived not with thunder, but with quiet acceptance. At home, she made a list. Not of groceries, but of things she would do before the first snow. Things that were hers alone. Bake her mother's peach cobbler recipe. Visit the orchard down by Miller's Creek. Reorganize her book collection in thematic order. Reread Jane Eyre one last time. Write thank you notes to the staff at the community center. Call Dorothy, her college roommate, just to hear her laugh again. Each task was a pebble on the path forward. Small grounding. She spent that afternoon in her reading room. The fireplace crackled low. A blanket around her knees, a book in hand. And a soft jazz record spinning on her vintage player. Her cat Mavis curled up beside her. Content. Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. Whole. It wasn't that the ache had disappeared. It was just smaller. Made manageable by choice. By boundaries. The next morning, she donated 5 boxes of clothing to the shelter. cleaned out her attic. She found old postcards from cities she had once visited: Rome, Kyoto, Istanbul, Santiago. Each card carried a different kind of memory. She placed them in a glass bowl by the entryway, a reminder that her life had been expansive, even when it felt small. That week, Evelyn began writing again. Not for publishing, just for herself. Short essays, reflections, memories. She titled the file After the Cake and wrote her first line, "Some birthdays are rebirths." She closed the laptop and watched the sun fall behind the trees. The sky was lavender gentle, and she realized this new chapter had no bitterness, only clarity. She had made peace with the absence, filled it with meaning, and the will tucked away in Jonathan's drawer. It was not revenge. It was reclamation, a quiet rewriting of who she would be remembered as. Not the forgotten aunt, not the convenient wallet, but a woman who had finally remembered herself and loved her own voice enough to let it echo far beyond bloodlines. She stood up, and for the first time in years hummed as she set the kettle to boil. A week passed quietly, and Evelyn's days began to take on a rhythm she hadn't felt since retirement first stole the structure from her calendar. She woke with the sun, not because she had to, but because the light through the curtains felt like a gentle invitation. She started journaling again. Not the neat, organized kind she used to teach her students, but sprawling thoughts, free-flowing and without apology. One page was simply a list of scents she loved: lavender, lemon zest, old books, fresh rain on pavement. Another was a memory of her father lifting her onto his shoulders at a county fair. Writing made her feel rooted, like her presence mattered even if no one else noticed. That Thursday, Evelyn decided to visit the town library. It had been months since she stepped inside. The building had changed little since she first moved to Vermont. Same creaky floors, same oak shelves, same smell of possibility. She greeted Marjorie, the head librarian, with a smile. The woman's face lit up as if seeing an old friend. "Evelyn, my goodness, we were just talking about you," Marjorie said. "And here you are, like a well-timed chapter." Evelyn chuckled. "Well, I'm here to return to the stories." She browsed the fiction aisle first, fingertips brushing spines like greeting old acquaintances. She checked out 3 books, all by female authors she once taught in her seminars. Back home, she lit a candle on her writing desk. The air smelled of amber and cedar. Her desk overlooked the garden, now stripped for winter. But even bare branches had a certain dignity. That night, as she stirred lentil soup on the stove, Evelyn thought about legacy. Not in the grand stone statue sense, but in the quiet footprint sense. She didn't have children, no spouse, but she had students. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some had gone on to write books. One had become a senator. She remembered them by the way they listened, by how their eyes lit up when a metaphor finally made sense. And it hit her then, as the soup simmered, that maybe she had been looking in the wrong place for celebration. She had been measuring value by who called, not who remembered silently. That night, she opened her email and searched for names from the past. Not family, but former students. She sent 5 simple messages. Just a note saying she had been thinking of them and hoped life had treated them with kindness. By morning, 3 had replied. Each message made her cry. One wrote, "You were the reason I didn't drop out my freshman year." Another said, "I still have the annotated poem you gave me, it lives on my desk." The third was from a student she barely remembered. He wrote, "I named my daughter after you." Evelyn sat back in her chair. The tears that came were not bitter. They were soft and full of grace. Later that day, she returned to her donation plans. She began writing a letter to the town's community college, offering funds to start a mentorship program for young women in the humanities. She titled it the Evelyn Moore Initiative. For voices overlooked. It felt right. It felt more permanent than property or stocks. Meanwhile, her family remained silent, oblivious. Her niece posted vacation photos online. Tropical drinks, sunburned cheeks, stage smiles. Her nephew promoted his podcast, one where he interviewed entrepreneurs but never mentioned the aunt who funded his first year at business school. Evelyn saw it all, not with malice but with a cool sort of detachment. It was like watching reruns of a show she no longer subscribed to. She no longer expected plot twists or redemptions. That weekend, she visited the hospice where her mother passed. She brought a box of baked goods and thank you cards. The staff remembered her. One nurse even cried. They spoke of her mother with warmth, not as a burden, but as someone they'd been honored to care for. Evelyn donated funds for a new break room. Caregivers need care too, she told them. She returned home feeling lighter, like she'd done something holy. That evening, she poured herself a glass of wine and toasted the quiet to her own name, to the love she had rerouted like a stream finding its true course. She opened her journal and wrote, "Family is not who remembers your birthday. It's who remembers your essence." The fireplace crackled. Outside, frost dusted the ground like powdered sugar. Evelyn smiled to herself, because for the first time in a decade, the world felt warm again. Even without candles, even without cards. She was not alone. She was alive. The days grew shorter and the Vermont landscape began to surrender to winter. Evelyn watched as the last stubborn leaves twirled to the ground like weary dancers taking their final bow. She had come to enjoy these still early evenings. There was peace in the slowness, in the way the light stretched just long enough to give her time to breathe before fading. On one such evening, she received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, formal, almost old-fashioned. She opened it carefully. Inside was a note from a foundation she had donated to anonymously years ago. They had tracked her down to inform her that a new youth reading room would be named in her honor. For the anonymous woman who sent stories where there was silence. Evelyn held the letter close to her chest. It was strange being seen when she hadn't asked to be. Later that night, she sat at her desk writing thank you notes. It had become a new ritual. One for the library, one for the college president, one for her old student who had named his daughter after her. Each card a small tether to the world. Her handwriting was still graceful, though slower now. The ink flowed like memory, soft, deliberate. As she sealed the last envelope, the doorbell rang. Startled, she glanced at the clock, nearly 8 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came unannounced anymore. Cautiously, she opened the door. On her porch stood a young woman holding a bundled coat to her chest. Evelyn nodded, lips parted. My name is Naomi, I think you knew my grandmother, Rose Whitman." Evelyn gasped softly. Rose had been one of her dearest friends. They had lost touch after Rose moved to Arizona. She hadn't known Rose had passed. Naomi explained she had found Evelyn's letters among her grandmother's belongings. Dozens of them. Letters filled with warmth, poetry, and the kind of friendship that lives beyond geography. She had driven hours to meet the woman who had shaped so much of her grandmother's heart. Evelyn invited her in. They sat by the fire, sipping tea as stories spilled from the cracks in time. Naomi shared how Rose had often read Evelyn's letters aloud. How they gave her comfort during chemo treatments. How Evelyn's words had made her laugh even when she had no strength. Evelyn wept not from grief, but from the strange, beautiful joy of mattering. They talked for hours. Naomi stayed the night in the guest room. In the morning, she helped Evelyn clean the attic. And together they sorted through decades of letters, books, and old newspaper clippings. Naomi asked if she could record Evelyn's stories for a podcast she was creating about remarkable women. Evelyn blushed, but agreed. She had never thought of herself as remarkable, only persistent. Naomi stayed 3 days. On the last day, she gave Evelyn a gift, a framed quote from one of her own letters to Rose. It read, "Sometimes you save a life just by showing up in the mailbox." Evelyn hung it in the hallway, right above the photo of her and Kayla at the beach. She didn't take the photo down, but now it felt like a chapter instead of a wound. A few days later, Evelyn received a call from a former colleague. Someone from the university. They invited her to give a guest lecture via Zoom. The topic, the unwritten lessons of literature. She hesitated, then said yes. The lecture was attended by over 70 students. Many of them weren't even born when she retired. And yet they listened, took notes, asked thoughtful questions. called her Professor Moore. That night, Evelyn sat on her porch, wrapped in a quilt sipping hot cider. And she laughed. Laughed because the universe had a strange sense of timing. She'd spent years chasing validation from people who never looked back. And now it arrived in waves from places she never expected. There was no bitterness, only a quiet awe. The next morning, she began writing a new letter. This one was to herself. "Dear Evelyn," it began, "I'm proud of you." She wrote about how she had grown, how she had learned that love didn't always come from family. Sometimes it came from students, from friends, from strangers, from letters rediscovered. She ended the note with, "Happy birthday whenever you feel like celebrating," then tucked it in the drawer beside her bed. That weekend, she baked 2 loaves of banana bread. One for the neighbor, one for the shelter. She walked them down herself. The sky was blue, the wind crisp. Children played in yards she used to avoid. But now their laughter warmed her. At the shelter, a small girl hugged her leg. Evelyn laughed. "Yes, sweetie, just for today." She walked home lighter than she had in years. And when she passed her mailbox, she stopped. She placed her hand on it and whispered thank you. Because sometimes it wasn't about what came inside, but about what had already been sent out. And in that, Evelyn was rich. Richer than she had ever known. Winter finally settled into Vermont with quiet insistence, blanketing Evelyn's world in white. Snow fell steadily outside her windows, softening the sharp edges of rooftops, trees, and memories. She had always loved winter. Not for the cold, but for the hush it brought, the way everything seemed to pause and listen. Inside her home, the radiators hissed warmly. Books stacked like old friends surrounded her reading chair. Mavis, her cat, had grown more affectionate with the season. Perhaps the chill made her cling tighter, or perhaps she sensed Evelyn's growing contentment. Each day followed a gentle pattern. A walk in the snow, a hot cup of tea, pages written in her journal. The podcast Naomi had started was gaining traction. She had titled it Echoes of Evelyn. Each episode featured a story, a letter, or a reflection from Evelyn's long, intricate life. Listeners from across the country began writing in. Some shared their own forgotten birthdays. Others thanked Evelyn for voicing emotions they had buried deep. Evelyn read every comment Naomi forwarded her. They made her laugh, cry, and sometimes shake her head in disbelief. It felt surreal. She was no longer invisible. One morning, she received a large envelope in the mail. It bore the seal of the Vermont Women's Hall of Legacy. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an official letter. She had been nominated for her lifetime of service to education, literature, and local philanthropy. There would be a small ceremony in March. She would be the oldest recipient that year. Evelyn held the letter for a long time. Not out of pride, but disbelief. All those years she had poured herself into others with no expectation. And now the world whispered back, "We saw you." That evening, she lit every candle in her house. Not for romance, but for light. She walked through the rooms slowly, remembering the years each corner had witnessed. Here she had once danced alone on her 50th birthday. There she cried after her sister's final voicemail. All of it mattered. Every fragment. She sat by the fire and wrote another letter to herself. This one began, "You were never forgotten, only waiting to be found." The next morning brought another surprise. Her doorbell rang at 10 and there stood Kayla, her niece. Older now. Face thinner, eyes darker, a nervous smile stretching across her lips. "Hi, Aunt Evie," she said. Evelyn stared at her for a moment too long, then nodded. Kayla stepped inside slowly. Her boots left wet impressions on the rug. She looked around as if seeing the house for the first time. And maybe she was. "I was driving through," she offered. "But really, I heard about the podcast, about everything." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry I disappeared." Evelyn motioned to the couch. "I was invisible, not gone." Kayla blinked, then lowered her head. "I didn't know how much I needed you until I realized you weren't picking up anymore. I didn't deserve all the chances you gave me." Silence stretched between them. Not sharp, just uncertain. Finally, Evelyn spoke. I used to wait for your birthday calls. I used to cry when they never came. But now I cry when strangers tell me I made them feel seen. Kayla wiped her eyes. I know I can't undo it. No, Evelyn agreed gently. But you can start here. They talked for hours, caught up like stitches trying to mend old cloth. Kayla admitted her life had unraveled more than once. Bad relationships, job losses, estrangement from her mother. I blamed everyone, she whispered. Even you, especially you, because you were the one who never gave up on me. Evelyn reached across the table, held her niece's hand. That love without boundary becomes expectation, not gratitude. Kayla nodded. I took it all and gave nothing back. Evelyn smiled faintly. But here you are, that counts for something. Before Kayla left, they stood in the foyer. She looked at the quote on the wall, her own aunt's words framed. That sometimes you save a life through the mailbox. Evelyn's eyes twinkled. Every word. Kayla hugged her tightly. And this time, Evelyn let herself hold on too. That night, Evelyn opened her journals. She wrote, forgiveness is not owed but offered, and sometimes the right moment arrives late but not empty. She folded the page and placed it in the drawer with her letter to herself. She imagined them sitting there like sisters, side by side. Outside, snow fell again. Heavier this time. But Evelyn didn't feel buried. She felt anchored. Anchored by words. By voices. By the people who found her not out of guilt but recognition. And that, she decided, was the only kind of return that mattered. March arrived with the scent of thaw. Snowmelt streamed down gutters and birdsong returned like shy applause. Evelyn awoke earlier than usual that morning. Her old bones hummed with something more than aches, anticipation. Today was the ceremony. The Vermont Women's Hall of Legacy would be honoring her, and for once she hadn't politely declined. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing her silver hair with quiet care. Her fingers moved slowly, reverently. She chose a dark blue wool dress, the one her mother had helped her buy the year she earned tenure. She added a string of pearls. Simple, elegant, untouched by time. When she arrived at the venue, Naomi was waiting with a bouquet of tulips. Her smile was bright, grounding. You look like a poem, Naomi said. Evelyn laughed softly. Inside, the room was warm with light and voices. People gathered around name tags and modest hors d'oeuvres. But when Evelyn entered, the hum paused. And then applause. Long, full-bodied and real. She had not expected it. She moved with grace toward the small stage. Her name written across a banner in golden letters. When the host introduced her, she listened quietly. She was not used to praise. Then it was her turn. She stepped up to the microphone. I never thought I'd stand here, she began. I didn't build bridges or cure illness, but I gave what I had, words. She looked out over the crowd. Eyes kind, voice steady. I taught, I wrote, I listened. Sometimes I simply showed up. Her hands didn't shake. Not once. And in doing so, I found that love doesn't always look like birthday cards or family reunions. Sometimes it's a student who remembers a line you wrote on their paper 20 years ago. She paused, smiled. Legacy is not who cries at your funeral. It's who lives differently because you lived. There was silence. Then another wave of applause. After the event, dozens came up to speak with her. Former students, young women she'd inspired through Naomi's podcast. One woman said, your story helped me leave a toxic marriage. Another whispered, you made me feel less alone. Evelyn listened. She held their words gently like snowflakes. Back home, she placed the framed certificate on the mantle, next to a photo of her mother. She poured herself a small glass of brandy, sat in her chair by the fire. Outside, the last snow of the season fell. It dusted the porch, the roof, the earth like a curtain call. She opened her journal, wrote, this is what it means to be remembered, not for your title but your tenderness. That weekend, she hosted a tea gathering. Not a party. Just a few neighbors, Naomi, and the hospice nurse who now called her weekly. Laughter filled the house like spring air through open windows. At one point, Kayla arrived. With flowers. They embraced. Evelyn introduced her to everyone, simply saying, "This is my niece." No explanation, no bitterness, only the warmth of second chances. Later that evening, Kayla offered to take a photo. "Just you and the fireplace," she said. Evelyn agreed. In the photo, her eyes glowed with a light that had taken 73 years to earn. The kind of light no spotlight could recreate. Weeks passed. The podcast episodes continued. Her mailbox began to fill again, not with bills or silence, but with gratitude. One card read, "I missed your birthday, but I'll never miss your words again." Spring pushed its way into the land. With green buds, new life, and the promise of warmer days, Evelyn began planting again. Tiny rows of herbs and flowers behind the house. She worked slowly, patiently, each seed a quiet prayer. One afternoon, she unearthed a small, rusted key while digging. She didn't know what it unlocked, but she kept it. Because some things didn't need answers, just appreciation. That night, she held it in her palm before sleep. She thought maybe this is what healing feels like. Not grand, not cinematic, just a rusted key, and a quiet heart that's no longer waiting to be called. By summer, Evelyn had compiled her letters, essays, and journal pages. Naomi helped her publish a small volume. They titled it Letters to the Silence. It sold modestly but reached deeply. Readers called it a balm. Reviewers called it a revelation. Evelyn called it closure. And maybe a beginning. On her 74th birthday, she didn't buy a cake. Didn't need to. Dozens of cards arrived. Calls, flowers, even a message from her nephew. But she didn't measure her joy by those things. She measured it by how free she felt. That evening, she walked barefoot through her gardens. Dirt between her toes, stars overhead. She whispered to the sky, "Happy birthday, Evelyn." No candles, no applause, just a voice that had finally become enough. And in that stillness, everything made sense. Legacy, she realized, was never about who you left behind. It was about what you carried forward, quietly, persistently, until the world remembered you by the love you gave. She was remembered.